Good evening, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to you. I'm Sister Barbara Reed, President of Catholic Theological Union, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this important conversation about the experiences of Muslim and Christian African Americans in today's United States. Tonight's program has been designed by Dr. C. Vanessa White, Associate Professor of Spirituality and Pastoral Ministry at CTU, and Dr. Saeed Atif Riswan, Assistant Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies and Director of the Catholic Muslim Studies Program at CTU. Interculturality and interreligious dialogue have long been a hallmark of CTU. As well, we work hard and intentionally at dismantling systemic racism. We will hear tonight from two outstanding scholars who bring to the fore voices of Black Christians and Muslims, whose voices are often sidelined in centers of power. CTU's commitment to the empowerment of Black Catholics has been embodied in our Augustus Tolton Pastoral Ministry Program and our certificate in Black Catholic Studies. The Tolton program is a full tuition scholarship program with formation tailored to the needs of Black Catholics. It was founded in 1990 and was led for 17 of its 33 years by Dr. C. Vanessa White. CTU's commitment to advancing understanding and collaboration between Muslims and Catholics and other Christians is visible in our Catholic Muslim Studies program, directed by Dr. Saeed Atif Riswan, now in its 23rd year. This evening's program is one of many steps in these ongoing efforts. I would now like to ask Dr. C. Vanessa White to add her welcome and to speak a bit more about our certificate in Black Catholic Studies. She'll be followed by Dr. Saeed Atif Riswan, who will tell you more about our Catholic Muslim Studies program and who will introduce our two distinguished speakers. Vanessa?
Welcome to this evening's presentation. As President Reed stated, I am the Associate Professor of Spirituality and Ministry and the Director of the Graduate Certificate in Black Theology and Ministry here at Catholic Theological Union. Our certificate in Black Theology and Ministry is specifically geared to those who wish to learn more about the Black religious experience, as well as develop skills to minister in the Black community. We offer courses throughout the academic year, such as our current course entitled Race, Caste in the Catholic Church, our May course on the spiritual writings of Sister Thea Bowman and Dr. Howard Thurman, and this summer's course on Black preaching and evangelization with Father Maurice Nutt, author of the first book of its kind on Black preaching in the Catholic context, entitled Deep Down in My Soul, published by Orbis Press. Thank you for your presence this evening as we offer the second in our series on the experiences of Muslim and Christian African Americans. Last semester, we focused on the historical dimensions. This evening, we will look at today's context. I now invite my colleague, Dr. Saeed Riswan, who will speak about the Catholic Muslim Studies program.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Good evening, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Saeed Atif Riswan, and just to talk a little bit about the Catholic Muslim Studies program, one of the central tenets of it is to promote mutual understanding, reconciliation, and cooperation between Muslims and Christians in order to advance justice and compassion in the human family. In other words, if we think about Revelation as made flesh in Jesus, and we think about Revelation as made word of the Quran, those two revelations, if anything, are about justice. And it is very important for the Catholic Muslim Studies program, as well as faculty at CTU, to have justice be an integral part of everything that we do. And it's especially important in our interreligious context as well. The Catholic Muslim Studies program offers public programming, such as this evening's program, as well as the one that we held in the fall. We offer various types of courses. I teach courses on Islam, on history of Muslim-Christian relations, as well as Christian-Muslim ethics. And we also offer scholarships for Muslim students, full scholarships who may be interested in enrolling in one of our master's program or our doctorate of ministry program. So for those of you who are interested, please feel free to email me about either auditing a class or partially or in part matriculating in one of our degree programs at sarizwan@ctu.edu. You can also find my email address on our website. So now I would like to talk a little about the equally important, if not more important part of tonight, which is our esteemed guests and panelists. I would like to begin with introducing Dr. Amina Beverly McLeod Addeen. Dr. Addeen is Professor Emerita of Islamic Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at DePaul University. In 2006, she founded the United States' first undergraduate baccalaureate program in Islamic World Studies. She is the former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture. Her book publications include African American Islam, Questions of Faith, Transnational Muslims in America, Introduction to Islam in the 21st Century, among others. Dr. Addeen is a senior Fulbright scholar, host of Critical Talk on Muslim Network TV production, board member of the Inner City Muslim Action Network, IMAN, board member of Sound Vision, Muslim Mental Health, and as well as American editor for the Muslim Minorities in the West series by Brill. Dr. Tia Noel Pratt, she is the Assistant Vice President for Mission Engagement and Strategic Initiatives, Courtesy Assistant Professor of Sociology, and editor of the Journal of Catholic Social Thought at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. A sociologist of religion by training, Dr. Pratt received her PhD in sociology from Fordham University in 2010. For more than 20 years, Dr. Pratt has researched and written about systemic racism in the Catholic Church in the US and its impact on African American Catholic identity. Dr. Pratt is currently working on a book, Faithful and Devoted: Racism and Identity in the African American Catholic Experience. Her academic work has been featured in the Interdisciplinary Journal of Research on Religion and multiple edited volumes. Dr. Pratt's award-winning public scholarship has been featured in Faithfully, Commonweal, The Revealer, National Catholic Reporter, and America. So we're just absolutely delighted to have both of you here today. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. And we are certainly looking forward to learning from the both of you and your wisdom. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Vanessa, who will talk a little bit about the structure and the framing of the conversation. And from there, we'll jump right into it. Vanessa?
Thank you, Said. Our format this evening is in two parts. We will begin with a series of 4 questions that we will ask our presenters to reflect on. And during this time, we also encourage you to write your own questions and comments in the chat. The final portion of the program will be the presenters responding to questions from our registered participants. Each of our panelists will have approximately 5 minutes to discuss the question that we will pose to them. And so we will begin with our first question. What are the different personal ways in which religion plays a role in the daily lives of African Americans? And so I invite Dr. Tia Pratt to begin our conversation.
Oh, I get to start.
You get to start.
Okay. Well, first, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a joy to be with you tonight and to share the stage with Dr. Amina and with both of you and to join CTU for this important conversation. That's a very big question. In 5 minutes, but all right, well, let's jump in and see where we go. The different ways, personal ways in which religion plays a role in the daily lives of African Americans. Well, that could take on a number of different paths. We could talk about how people live their lives in terms of, forming the way religion forms personal values and the ways that in which people shape their lives, in which African Americans shape their lives. It's also a means of looking at prayer and how prayer shapes the lives of African Americans. But also, one of the things that has been important in my work is looking at the ways religion is used and the way religion helps to form how African Americans deal with all of the stressors of racism and disenfranchisement and all of the marginal ways African Americans are marginalized in our society, how religion is a vehicle for dealing with that in an individual personal way, on a day-to-day basis of just continuing to live and thrive in your own life. But also when we look at where our leaders in the struggle came from, especially, throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st century, those leaders in the struggle emerged from religion.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Pratt. And I invite Dr. Dean to speak now.
Well, ditto to all of the thank yous for inviting us for a very important conversation, and also mostly ditto to what my colleague said, because that is so very true. I think that additionally, it's for us as Muslims, it's shaping a life around daily prayer, because we pray 5 times a day. And so we're constantly interjecting into the secular life, the religious life. But also, I think in personal ways, for me, it is, how school affects things, and how Muslim children go to Catholic schools, they go to Protestant schools, in addition to Islamic schools, and so you're always negotiating one thing or the other. When my kids were teenagers, because we have Black Catholics in the family, and there were service days to do this, that, whether it was a food pantry or this, that, and the other, my kids went too. But it is, I think, the African American community is a unique one in the sense that there are many different religions in one family. And people learn very early how to, well, they're really not negotiating, it's really beating kids over the head. Well, yes, you are going to participate in this food pantry. No, you're not going skating now. And then there is the dinner talk around politics. So in personal ways, I think in the African American community in general, we're fuller, if that makes sense, than some other ethnocentric communities. And don't have, our dialogue is ongoing. It's not staged or, one where you have to have a convivium to talk.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I'll leave it there.
Well, we still have a few moments if either Dr. Tia or Dr. Dean, if you'd like to add to what you said or would like to ask a question to each other regarding this question.
Well, I'd very much like to follow up on what Dr. Aldine said about, Muslim students in Catholic schools, because, I am based in Philadelphia, in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and particularly our Catholic schools within the city. We and our Catholic schools within the city that are majority African American. There are certainly Catholic students, but the Catholic students are not the majority of students. The majority of students are Protestant or Muslim, or sometimes don't have a particular faith tradition at home at all, but they are in Catholic school. And so that, and I agree, it's not a negotiation, but that conversation is ongoing. And it's ongoing in such a way that we don't always realize that that's what's
Yeah.
happening, because it's not happening in this formal way with big titles attached to it like we're doing here tonight.
Mhm.
It's happening in the way that we are sharing each other's lives and accompanying each other, as we move throughout our lives.
Mhm.
And this happens, there are kids in pre-K that are doing this because they're in school together.
Mhm.
Very true. Very
Mhm.
true. And many are thriving.
Mm.
I think that the teachers in these institutions bring a sensibility with them about the diversity in their classrooms, and not tippy-toe around subjects, but make subjects meaningful, and kids giving presentations about stuff. Philadelphia is such a wonderfully diverse place for education because there the Catholic schools, there's the Lutheran school, they're the Quaker schools, they're the charter schools, and parents have loads of choices, which I think in many ways they see as enriching, because the schools are also playing each other in sports.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. I turn it over to you, Said, for question number 2.
Sure, thank you. So question number 2 are, what are the different communal ways in which Christianity and Islam play a role in the lives of African-American Christians and Muslims? So taking it a little bit to a little bit of a larger level, and perhaps, you both of you started to touch on that in terms of, going to school and different things, and perhaps into adult life and what religion, in terms of self-identifying may mean for communities. And here, Dr. Ammon, I would love for you to take the lead in responding.
Well, again, I think that the African American community, I don't want to say is a special entity, but it is in many ways, because we have so many people in the family that you're in and out of various religious places and spaces and conversations all the time. I was trying to, at CTU. I've been in and out of CTU more times than I can count. When they redid portions of the building, oh, it was just spectacular. But anyway, the always welcome. Nobody is asking you what's your religion, is where do you want us to direct you to, to do whatever it is you're going to do. And I think that happens in most places. I think African Americans, because, and I don't want to call it an innate sensibility, we are happiest around each other. So in the Muslim community, for us, the immigrant masajid are very often hostile. They're hostile to women, Black women, you know, when they line you up, they don't ask you what your religion is, um, are very sensitive to any sense of uh, demeaning talk, diminution of space, and those kinds of things. So they will tend to go to African American masajid.
Mm.
They will also interject themselves into immigrant spaces, but often they are marginalizing space. But I think that largely inviting people to Muslim spaces has been an ongoing thing since people began in the early part of the 20th century to transition to Islam. So you often have felt we've had CTU members in the masajid, you know. I mean, there are different ways of practicing communally. I think we're happiest amongst ourselves as we work out what everybody else is doing to us.
Mhm.
Mm.
Dr. Tia?
Thank you. You know, I'm thinking about in a similar way to what Dr. Amina has said, you know, in my work, in my research, what I hear a lot from folks who are not African American, but attend predominantly African American Catholic churches is what drew them there.
Mhm.
Besides the music that just drew them in, besides that, it was the sense of welcome. And a sense of welcome that, having gone to Catholic churches their whole life, they never experienced until they came to a Black church. And so that sense of community and building community with where you are, with who is there, is something that that we see a lot. And also too, you know, as we touched on a little bit with the last question, you know, it is very common for African Americans to have multiple religious traditions within the family. So that sense of community and community building across religious denominations happens all the time. And as I said earlier, we don't always put a name to it because it happens so frequently and it is so normal that we don't necessarily realize that that's what we're doing until we're in spaces like this where we're putting a name to it and realizing that, you know, some of us have been experts at it for years and not realized it. So in terms of community and communal importance, you know, that sense of welcome is very important, and extending that welcome, you know, across within the African American community, across religious denominations, and in some cases even, you know, to those who are not African American, and that sense of welcome, especially extending welcome to those who would not necessarily be so welcoming to us, is also important and a hallmark as well.
Mm-hmm.
Let me add something there that I think is it's just like Dr. Tia just said, you know, we're doing it and not paying attention. If you think about how we worship, Islam is very gender-based. So when you go up the steps to the masjid, traditionally, what happens is the men go one way and the women with their children go another way. In all of the Christian churches, whether they're Protestant or Catholic, families worship together. Very different scenario. But in that families worshiping together, you get an opportunity to teach children about a sacred space. Very different in terms of just going in. But it's the gender amongst the African American Muslims that causes the most problems. You
Mm.
know, women way at the back, they can't hear what's going on. And it's very typical in the Muslim world. But in many of the African American communities, they don't do that. They worship in an African manner in which the space is rounded,
Mhm.
so that there's an equality of folk coming to hear. I don't not using the space, however, like many of the Christian spaces are, where you're teaching the children how to behave, you
Mhm.
know, where their focus should be.
Mhm.
Just adding that on. But I noticed that in one of the classes that I was teaching, that it became important to see, how do you worship communally? Do you worship as an individual, or do you worship as a family?
Mm.
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, it's a good question that you're posing, and what does community, I mean, you're asking a question, which is what is implicit in what you're asking is also, what does community mean, right? So
Yeah.
is community based on gender, or is it based on religious affiliation, or a combination thereof? And that intersectionality then is further complicated by issues of race, which both of you in your own work and what you've talked about here is also a aspect that needs to be kept in mind. And one thing that, you know, that I'm curious to hear more about from both of you is that the history of colonialism has had its different impact on Muslims, and certainly on those who become Muslims, who converted to Islam, as well as, you know, in antebellum, during the slave trade, those who came, and the ways in which a form of Christianity, a white form of Christianity, was imposed in certain ways as well. And so when thinking about, you know, decentering power and thinking about how to push back against the colonial project and its vestiges that still remain, can you talk a little bit about how it's done, maybe communally? So, for example, Dr. Amina, you have a book, you know, African American Islam. Is there a way to talk about American Islam where the African part doesn't necessarily have to be qualified, because American Islam is necessarily tied to the Black Muslim experience? And similarly, Dr. Tia, you know, is there a way to talk about Catholic theology without having to put in without having to qualify Black Catholic theology? In other words, to center the the communities, the African American communities, in ways that have been decentered intentionally, and certainly continue to be decentered, perhaps in some spaces unintentionally and intentionally.
Mm.
Well, I think that you hit the nail dead on the head, so to speak. And here, I think we're doing this program because of Black History Month. It's not a question of what the Black folk in either community bring to the overall religious tradition. Again, we've been marginalized. And hopefully we in the future grow beyond that, because in our faith families, you know, we're integral parts, not, you know, someone you bring out of the kitchen for show. So I think that that becomes critical. And there is, you know, what? I don't like the word convert, mostly because it doesn't speak to the African American Muslim experience. A series of transitions is a better way of looking at it, because we're bringing people from one stage in orientation to another, as the Quran asked us to do. I think that there is not an antipathy, not a real antipathy in the African American community against the Christian community. What there is a kind of wanting to move away from any vestiges of enslavement religion and back to something pre-enslavement. And that is still very, very much alive.
Hmm. Well, you know, I got 5 minutes, right? And my
You can take a
entire
little bit more time, no problem. Go
you
ahead.
know, my entire professional life has been pushing back against, just, the point that you made in the question. In my book, I have a chapter on liturgy as identity work and an act of resistance to racism.
Mm.
Because, you know, bringing in those elements of African American culture into the Catholic worship space, that is still, all these decades after this has been a part of what the Black Catholic community has been doing. It's still, well, what you're doing is not really Catholic. How dare you do that? When really, that's coded language for it's not white.
Mm. Mm.
And if I had a nickel for every time a reporter called me and said, well, what do you say to the people who say it's not Catholic? I say, when you mean white, say it.
Mm.
Instead of saying all the time that these things aren't Catholic, when they are so beautifully and richly Catholic.
Mhm.
But your problem is that they're not white.
Mm.
So, so that and doing and standing up to that is an act of resistance to the racism.
Mhm.
And whether that happens, in liturgy, whether that happens in our Catholic schools, Catholic schools, especially in urban areas, are places where the church meets African Americans where they are at, whether they are Catholic or not, whether that experience of encounter with the church inspires them to learn more and become Catholic, or not. That connection is still there. So, the part of that and what has to happen and is happening is the centering of and the telling of our own narrative.
Mm.
The Black Catholic syllabus, which I first put together in 2020, that's the whole point of it, is to center the voices of Black Catholics in the creation of our own narrative. Because if we're not telling our own stories, then somebody writes them for us, and then we're pushed to the margins of our own stories.
Exactly.
And we are in a place where we can and should and are and must just not tolerate that decentering of our own narrative anymore. So that constant, pushback and it against that narrative, I still hear, oh, there's such a thing as Black parishes. Oh, there's such a, oh, wait, wait, there are Black Catholics? Huh?
Yeah.
Pew did a whole report on Black Catholics. Yeah, because there are more Black Catholics than there are, members of the AME Church in the United States. So, it is, after all these years, it is frustrating to still have that same conversation over and over. But it also means that the work must continue, the struggle must continue. And, here we are continuing to work our way, in the struggle to the mountaintop.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you for that sober and candid reflection. Appreciate it. Dr. Amina, obviously within the mosque, if we reconstitute what Dr. Tia is saying about what it means, to be Catholic, and in some ways how that's tied to race, and particularly in white Catholicism, can you talk a little bit about what African Americans experience in the mosque. You know, is it about an Arab Islam? Is it about a South Asian Islam? And that it somehow sidelines what what Islam means for someone like yourself, you know, that is neither of those things or identifies with those, you know, those ethnicities. So if you can talk a little bit about, you know, how you see it transpiring in the mosques and among Muslims.
Well, I think people coming from majority Muslim states bring with them their own particular kinds of colonialisms. And they're generally speaking, really began to practice Islam when they hit these shores, and there was an opportunity to capitalize on it. So you have a lot of different agendas where the move from the overwhelming kind of Protestantation of the religious space in the United States. People don't know much about, I spend a lot of time distinguishing Catholics from Protestants. And they say, what? You know, and because they want to make Catholicism one religion and Protestantism another, you know, and if you go and say, well, how about different ways? Do you know anything about the history of Protestantism? Well, no, but you know, but in Islam, more so it is a host of ideologies that have come from their fights against various aspects of colonialism and being left with what? A focus on ritual. Whereas here, many transitioning to Islam, there are very few Black folk you have to talk about God to. You know, they got God. How they're going to approach God, how they're going to make God a handmaiden in their lives is a different story. And so there's been a lot of antipathy between the two groups because everybody, you know, the South Asians, they got Islam. The Arabs, they got the Quran is written in Arabic, and you say, well, that's nice, but you can't read it either. And the people you're talking to don't speak Arabic largely. You know, then you have, I mean, there are 87 minimally different ethnic groups of Muslims in this country. And getting through who has and who doesn't is quite a chore. But here in America, most Americans don't really understand themselves as having had a colonial experience. Even though we could easily say that slavery was a part of a colonial experience, but that takes a little bit of study. But they see the other world as having had a colonial experience. So, you know, it's a little bit different. And everybody who thinks they got it wants everybody else to understand everything in the same way, whether it's about women, oh, the men do this, that, and the other to the women. And I'm saying, oh, well, it wouldn't be good to even try to dismember an African-American woman, because after you got the grits off, there wouldn't be much left to fight with. You know, I mean, there is inside of the genders a different relationship. So it's looking at relationships between parents and children, what expectations are, expectations about gender, but also expectations about power and authority and knowledge.
Thank you. Well, I have a ton of more questions to this topic, but we can come back to it in the Q&A. I'll hand it over to Vanessa for discussion point number 3, which you touched on a little bit before, but we can get into a little bit more in detail. Vanessa?
Thank you, Saeed. Our discussion topic question number 3 is, what forms of interreligious dialogue exist between and among Christian and Muslim African Americans? And so looking from your own experience and your own research, have you seen that there are forms of interreligious dialogue that have existed? And how are those expressed and how are those lived out? And so we begin with Dr. Tia.
Okay, thank you. So, we've touched on some of this, with our discussion, so far.
Mhm.
But so I want to reiterate, something that's already been said, that this is something that happens when, and with folks don't also always know that this is what they're doing.
Mhm.
Because going back to, African Americans having multiple religious traditions within the family, within the close friend group, it can in that space, it can take the role of those deep conversations that go long into the night. But it can also be, I have invited my cousin and his family, I have invited my close friend and her family to my home for dinner, but I'm going to make sure I serve a meal that they can eat.
Mhm.
That is within the guidelines of their diet, and taking that into consideration, being thoughtful and intentional about that. And food as dialogue, we all know that is some of the most powerful dialogue that we have, in the human story. Um, so it happens certainly in these formal ways that we're doing tonight, like what happens, in your certificate program that you have at CTU, but also in these informal and in some respects perhaps deeper and more meaningful ways, that it can happen. So I'll pause there, and then maybe we'll have a chance to circle back.
Mhm.
Dr. Amina?
We go back to what the question was. I was so interested in her answer.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And so the question is, looking at your particular context and research and your experience, what forms of interreligious dialogue have you witnessed or experienced or researched exists between Christian and Muslim African Americans?
Formal dialogue, from my vision experience, there's very little. It's around
Mhm.
issues. It's
Mhm.
around food. All of the moms are screaming about what their daughters are wearing. Doesn't matter if they're Christian or Muslim. And where did you buy that hair from? There are different kinds of conversations that may or may not have obvious religious meaning. It's teaching kids how to budget, which is not necessarily, you know what I'm saying? It's not theological. Um, Inside of the community, it's around issues. It's when either of us go to talk to others that things kind of the pot boils over.
Mm.
I see some very pensive people out there in the audience, and I hope they're still awake enough to join us in this fruitful conversation.
They're in deep thought. You know, what you're bringing up, it's
I know.
having deep thought. That's what's happening. And also they're probably thinking back about their own experience
Yeah.
and within their own family. Because when you were talking, I was thinking about, both you and Tia were talking, I was thinking about a question that was asked me years ago about what was my ecumenical and interreligious dialogue. Did I believe in that or something around that? And I said, you just have to look at my family in the sense of who that there's always that informal dialogue when we get together, because in my family it's Christian, it's Muslim, and it's Buddhist. And
Right.
so
Some of those too.
and so when we come together, we may talk about religion or we may not. It may come out in other ways. I'd say sometimes you go through the back door to get to the front door. And so that's what happens. But that those conversations and those relationships are what's important, and moving from those relationships into dialogue, into how that relates to our lived reality.
Yes.
I think that's what's important. T, anything else you have to say before we move on? I want to give you some final thoughts on this question.
Well, something that comes to mind as well in terms of where this interreligious dialogue takes place. I keep coming back to not just in the home and among family and close friend groups, but also in schools, also in our civic organizations. And you think about you have kids that are whether they're in dance class or Girl Scouts or whatever it is. This is also a space where this can happen. But you have a Girl Scout troop that's attached to a church, and the kids that come don't necessarily belong to the church, but they live in the neighborhood. So they could belong to that church or not, but they live in the neighborhood. And so that means that exposure, that accompaniment starts to happen through something else. So it goes back to what you were saying, Vanessa, about you come in through the front door by opening up the back door. So this is happening in a myriad ways, but because the informality of it, we don't necessarily put a label on it, but that doesn't make it any less important or powerful.
Well, don't you kind of think that the whole notion of the necessity, this more modern, contemporary necessity for interreligious dialogue is an aftershoot of the Holocaust and the religious impetus that was there? I know Muslims had a very difficult time trying to figure out, okay, what's going on here? Let me do some more reading. Not having been intimate with the historical facts on the ground and trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, technically, Islam doesn't have theology in the same way Christianity does. So it became, I don't want to debate Jesus, who I think is great, with Muhammad, who I also think is great. Now, if you want to talk about using the names of those that we consider prophetic in vain, that's a conversation I have with some of my grandchildren. Don't go there, don't do that, But the heavy theological debates about who's right and wrong seem to have come from another origin.
That's just something to ponder right there. Just anything to ponder that question right there. But I am also aware of our time, so I'm going to turn it over to Saeed for our final question.
Sure. And as I talk about this final question, what challenges do African Americans face as Christians and as Muslims? Why do African Americans remain Christian or Muslim, given in light of some of these challenges, particularly intra-communal challenges? I'd also like to invite the audience to submit questions to the chat. And what we'll do is, as we discuss this question, topic number 4, Vanessa and I will also pepper in questions that come through the audience, and we'll just transition to the Q&A in responses to what Dr. T and Dr. Amina have to say about this question. So please, as you listen, also think about any questions that you've had. We've had a couple come in already. I will pose them as we continue the conversation. And then please, think about it and again, submit it through the chat to either myself or to Vanessa, and we'll get them over to the panelists. So with that, Dr. Amin, I'll ask you to respond first, please.
What challenges? Number one, racism. Number two, classism. I don't know. Gender and class are kind of running, neck and neck at the race. I don't know who's going to get first billing. In the side of Islam, gender certainly.
Hmm.
And it may trump class. Oh, I hate using that word. Okay, it may succeed class. Sorry. In many ways. In this country, Black women have been the bone. I don't know if there's another one, marrow of progress,
Mhm.
of challenges, upholding whether it's a church or masjid or a synagogue, whatever it is. And in Islam has a different set of stuff going on. And immigrants have brought it. Many of the African American women don't like it. But figure, keep it to yourself. Don't try to impose it across an aisle. That's a challenge. It's really, really a challenge as they fight their understanding about becoming American. African Americans largely consider themselves already American with challenges and don't see that they have to further enslave themselves to notions that remain unthought or uninterrogated to find a way to get those in power to smile at them. We know the results of that. So there you go. I'm anxious to hear these questions. Okay, there you go.
Dr. Tia.
Okay, a couple of things. I mean, so the first part of that question and the beautiful response from Dr. Amina, what I was thinking is, the challenges of racism, the challenges of, whether we call it classism, whether we call it socioeconomic status, whether we call it jobs, economic justice, whatever we're going to use it. I mean, these are the challenges of being African American in this society. I mean, those challenges they don't know religion. I mean, those are the challenges of being African American in this society. As to the second part of that question, I'd like to address it and respond to it in a way that I have had to and been called on to do many times in my career in the specific context of African American Catholics. And so there's two responses. There's the response of gentle accompaniment, which I have given, which is a response that I learned from my great uncle many years ago when I was visiting him in New Orleans. I was in New Orleans for work, working on a project for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that took me to New Orleans, and sitting, at the dining room table of him and my great aunt, and they wanted to know why I was in town, and because they knew going to see them was a bonus, and my uncle started to tell me about his activism in the local Black Catholic community in New Orleans, and I found out over the next few days just how that he was actually being modest, and everybody knew him. And he was telling me about the letters that he would write to Pope, and because he would say, "Baby, the Holy Father needs to know what they're trying to do down here in New Orleans," and he would say, he said to me, "Baby, this is my church, and I'm not going to let them mess it up." And so that's the answer of gentle accompaniment. but I've kind of moved away from that in the last couple of years, and towards a path of, I don't know if I like the word bluntness, but we'll go with that. That this is a question, like how can you be Black and be in this racist church? This is a question that only white folks ask, because it is completely unfathomable to be in a space that is not made for them. And yet, as African Americans, we have to figure out how to be in spaces that are not made for us, that don't want us, that will do anything that they can to push us out. And we still have to figure out a way to make a way where there was no way. So, so to that, I say, well, why wouldn't I stay in this church if I've decided that that's what I want to do? And the recent Pew study on Black Catholics in America, it tells us that only 54% of adults that were raised of Black Americans who were raised Catholic still practice Catholicism into adulthood. I mean, that's a huge loss in population. So that is something that the Catholic Church of the United States has to reckon with. It has to figure out what why that is happening and what needs to be done about it. And that is being reflected on not just in my work as a sociologist. We had Father Brian Massengale visit us at Villanova back in November. And, as a theologian and a social ethicist, as a Christian ethicist, Father Massengale reflected on that very topic in his talk that he gave for us at Villanova. So this is something that needs to take center stage as we continue to move forward.
I like your second response. Thank you. Dr. Amina, thoughts?
Where is that audience? I see some people over there. What y'all got to say? Wake up. Stop thinking.
If we in the spirit of following Dr. Tia's candid response, one person asked, when you said that interreligious dialogue becomes challenging when things boil over, what does that mean? And what gets things to that point, and how do you deal with it in a very real way?
I think that some folk from other ethnic groups have a great deal of difficulty dealing with the topic of racism, because it's such a bad word. Oh my God, don't call me racist. There is no racism in Islam, and I can respond, there probably isn't any in Islam, but you are, and you're acting upon it at this moment. And let me tell you all the ways. I think that colonization has colored the world in ways that are really, really bad. In countries, South Asia, to be as white as you can get with skin lightening creams, just as they were here, is outrageous. It's the same way in demonizing really the Black populations of many North African and West African countries. I mean, it's everywhere one turn, everywhere you turn, and that's the boiling over. There's a Quranic edict about seeking knowledge, and when African American Muslims go out, what they find is that many in the Muslim world are so deeply racist that their experiences are not good. They have to go into synagogue and Gambia and Ghana, where they find both the Christians and the Muslims very welcoming,
Mhm.
to have some peace of mind. And that's difficult when you say you want to be an Islamic State, and they boil over. I mean, there have been instances in the masjid where the woman is saying, "Why are you sticking me all the way in the back or another room or another building? What are you doing? I'm here to worship, not look at you."
Mhm.
You know, and they're screaming
Mhm.
about, this is worship time. This is not get your gender on time.
Mhm.
So that's what I mean by boiling over, to participate in worship spaces where you have zero say about how money is spent, what activities are deployed, is very, very marginalized.
Mhm.
Any thoughts, Dr. Tia, to that?
I was just so completely, absorbed by Dr. Amina's response. The boiling over, we see the boiling over in a lot of spaces, particularly within Christianity, within Catholicism. We're having this, I don't want to call it internal debate, because it's not internal completely. It has boiled over into, the more, public realm. And this boiling over, it will be interesting to see where things are in the next decade or two, particularly in our urban areas, as churches continue to close, as participation continues to decline, as we have folks of all racial persuasions who are raised in the church but are not raising their children in the church. And this is something that we see across religious denominations. What does this mean for organized religion in the decades to come? If you don't have 30-year-olds with young children in religious and sacred spaces now, you're not going to have 20 and 30-year-olds in those sacred spaces, in the decades to come. Because why would they be there if they weren't exposed to it as they were growing up? So this is something that those of us who work in and care about organized religion need to pay attention to. That being said, the boiling over it that we see in Catholicism, particularly around, if we're going to talk about pro-life, let's really talk about pro-life. You know what? Let's talk about the death penalty. Let's talk about mass incarceration. Let's talk about systemic racism as a public health crisis, because it is. Let's not limit our pro-life conversation to just one thing. And the fact that tonight's event comes to us from the Bernardine Center and Cardinal Bernie's work on the seamless garment, this is all the synergy of all of this coming together in this moment. It's so wonderful and beautiful, and if we don't do that, if we don't have that conversation as we should, and as the magnitude of the moment calls us to, then I don't know where we're all going to be in 20 or 30 years.
Well, the question that I have really speaks to what you are saying, but I will ask it anyway. It came up in the chat. How does Dr. Amina and Dr. Tia situate their respective communities in light of contemporary activism on justice issues, including Black Lives Matter movement. How does faith play a role?
Hmm. Well, I think faith should help you get up and get out the door
Mm.
to do something. And I was thinking about what Dr. T has just said about organized religion. And in Islam, that's kind of a term we don't think about.
Mhm.
But I think that whether we think about it or not, organized religion or religion, faith communities need to get up and get moving. I mean, there's lots of stuff. If all of us were out in the streets, some of the shooting would decrease. If all of us were at the hospitals, and speak for those who perhaps can't speak for themselves, then there would be some decreases. We just got to get up and get out. I think Black Lives Matter reminded me of the 60s where people, college students and not, patrol the streets to decrease both police wanton access to just young Black and Latino kids in the street. We, in other groups, began Head Start before it became Head Start. You know, there are many things that we have ceased to do. And that's how faith plays a role. You got to get up and do, not just sit back and ponder. Because you can ponder yourself to death and never get anything done.
Mhm,
Mhm. Mhm.
mhm.
Well,
Go on, Tia, you're jumping.
well, I'll say this. I very much see myself as a scholar practitioner.
Mhm.
I don't believe in scholarship for scholarship's sake. I don't believe as a sociologist, I don't believe in data for data's sake.
Mhm.
That we have to do this work because it serves a broader purpose in our society, that it serves a broader purpose in the struggle.
Mhm.
So this is why, in the institutions where I've worked, why the DEI work matters, why the anti-racism work matters, that in the Catholic Church, calling out the systemic racism, calling out that conflation, that false conflation of Catholic with white matters. And I very much see this work that I do as a modern day overturning of the money changers tables. That is where I take my lead from the Gospels.
Mhm.
So in that respect, that's how I see this, progressing. That's how I see, myself and my work situated in the broader conversation. It's and for those who say otherwise, constantly refuting this notion that the teachings of the Catholic Church and the mission of Black Lives Matter movement, they are not contrary to one another. They speak to each other, and we have to embrace that, or we're going to lose the few young people that we've got. And so, so this is how I work this, and how I situate myself in this broader conversation.
Mhm.
Really important points that both of you said. We just have a few minutes left, and we have a bunch of questions that I'm sad to say that we're not going to be able to get to. But Dr. Amina, you said a couple times to wake up the audience and make sure that they're still connected. what would be, one, I hope people are able to digest and to absorb and to reflect upon everything that's been shared tonight. I certainly have and really appreciate it. What would be something that you think is very important for the audience to take away tonight when we think about the the role and the place of African Americans in our communities at large and within our religious communities as well, and for folks to reflect upon as they leave this space and go into their own personal spaces. And the same question for Dr.
I
Tia.
think the largest thing is how are you going to continue the conversation?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, CTU has been a place where these conversations go on and are supported. So for those in the audience that know where CTU is, I can tell you where it is on 57. Is it 57th or 54th?
54th.
Yeah. And get down there, take the courses, push for more conversations with the two folk you see up here today. They're very important conversations that enlighten both sides.
Mhm.
Because as important it is for you to hear from us, it's important for us to hear what's on your mind. Which is why I kept asking you to wake up, say something, interrupt. As professors, we talk all the time. And to students where we don't know if you hear us, you're doodling or whatever it is else that you could be doing, but join in conversations when you hear them going, when you're around folk that seem to not understand, put your voice out there.
Mhm.
Thank you. Dr. Tia?
Well, I want to co-sign everything Dr. Amina has already said, and I don't know that I have much to add, and I would say, given this that we're on Zoom, I know that most folks are in the Chicago area, but for those that are not, continue the conversation where you are. Find a place and a space, and for those who are in the Chicago area, you have friends and relations that aren't, talk with them, say, I was in this webinar and this is what I heard, this is what I learned, and take that conversation outside of this, Zoom box that we're in together tonight, and make it happen. And if you feel like the conversation is insufficient where you are, then, as Dr. Amina said, put your voice out there. Say, why aren't we at your churches, at the mosque, at the synagogue? Why aren't we having these conversations? Why aren't we having the leaders from the place of worship down the street here to join us for a meal, for an event where we can learn about and from and with each other?
Thank you. Well, thank you, so much, Dr. Amina and Dr. Tia, for your time, for your wisdom. I desperately want to continue to be your friends and learn from you, and really, really appreciate everything that you've shared. And thank you so much. And I hope others took away as much as I think I personally did from this conversation. I'd also like to thank Peter Cunningham, Associate Director of the Bernstein Center, for being an amazing Zoom maestro and toggling back and forth between slides and making everything go so smooth. I really appreciate it, Peter. I also like to thank, my colleague, Dr. Vanessa White, and for the support and for, helping us connect us all in different ways and bringing her wisdom to this as well. And again, CTU offers classes at different levels, for auditing purposes, that you can do that if you like, or matriculate in a program. So please come and join. And if you'd like to sit in a course, feel free to to email one of the professors or the professor that the class you're interested in, and see if you can even just sit on one just to get a flavor for what's happening. Tonight's program also would not have been possible without the support of the Waraich family and the Waraich Family Fund. So I'd also like to thank them as well. And so I hope we all can take something away from tonight's conversation. I hope that, we can all live into our fates and what it truly means to be God's children. In the Quran, it says, "Laqad karamna bani Adam," which is that God says we have indeed endowed every progeny of Adam with dignity. And so that demands that we all look to what that means and find dignity, not only in ourselves, but in our fellow person as well. And I again thank the panelists, Dr. T and Dr. Amna, for their wisdom. So thank you all. God bless you all, and with peace and blessings, and especially blessings of Lent. Have a great evening.